Hi there, students. I had a request to make a video about the word vintage. Well, vintage can be both an adjective and a noun. Let's see, this word comes from the making of wine, and notice it begins V-I-N, vin, which is wine in French. Okay, vintage in winemaking is all of the grapes that were picked and grown in a single specific year in either a vineyard or in an area. Okay, so the vintage of a wine is the different years that the wine was made in. Okay, so the vintage is the harvest of wine, or harvest of grapes that's then made into wine. And they say that some vintages are good and some vintages are bad in different years. They also use the word vintage, particularly in port. Vintage port. This says that the port is very good quality. Yeah, so you can have port and vintage port. Port from a very good year. Port is made from grapes as well. Okay, so a vintage port. So here we've gone from just the year that the grapes were picked to a very good quality product, a very good quality wine. Yeah. Okay, then let's see. This word has then been taken further. Something produced in the past that is typical of the period in which it was made. Yeah, so a vintage car. I think vintage cars are actually defined as cars made between something like 1925 and 1930 or something like that. So a vintage motor car or a vintage watch. So made in the past, but to very high quality. Yeah, typical of the year it was made. A vintage comic book, a vintage aeroplane. Now, over the last probably 20 years or so, the word vintage has also come to substitute the word antique. Yeah, used to describe clothing or jewelry or objects from the past, especially when it's a very good example of that style from the past. So many people love to buy vintage clothing. She turned up to the party in a vintage dress. Okay, I think maybe they use the word vintage because antique. Well, antique actually has a definition. An antique should be something more than 100 years old. I think if something is vintage, it just means old, a classic example of something that was made in the past. Notice we can then take this further. This film is vintage Disney. This is vintage Pinewood Studios. It's typical and the best. It has all the typical characteristics and the best quality of a particular thing. I think the play Pygmalion is vintage Bernard Shaw. So it's a very good quality example of something in the past. I'm thinking period furniture, okay, something that was made in the period, not copying another style. And people use the word vintage nowadays in that way. Yeah, he gave a vintage performance, a classic example of what he was doing. So it's vintage. Vintage is effectively nowadays a word for something old. Yeah, something characterized by maturity and quality, and it has enduring appeal. It's classic. Yeah. the vintage songs from the 1920s. Yeah, maybe you collect vintage records, 78s. Okay, so distinctive. Yeah. The vintage British stockbroker going to work on the train in the morning with his bowler hat and his umbrella, reading the Times. Okay, so vintage, something that is high quality, old, and has enduring appeal, or something classic. Yeah. So, effectively old-fashioned, but vintage. Originally it comes from winemaking. So, how formal is vintage? I think you could use this word anywhere. It's a 5 in formality. Yeah, so a nice easy word. And this is another of these words that comes to us from Latin through French. Okay, you've got an old French word, vendage, which itself comes from Latin, vendemmia, which is the gathering of grapes. They still have this word in Spanish, vendimia, which is the picking of grapes, and therefore vintage. From vitum, wine, and demo, to take away, vendemmia. Yeah, vinum, wine, and demo, to take away, to remove. So you take away the grapes from the vine. So, vintage, a vintage wine, a classic wine, a quality wine, a wine made in a specific year. The 1987 Bordeaux vintage is a very good one. I have no idea. Somebody will probably tell me it was a terrible one. But it's definitely a vintage. Vintage, a vintage wine, a vintage car, good quality made in the past. Vintage, something that was is a good example of it. So I hope this video will be vintage I swear English. Yeah, a good example of what I do. So anyway, enough. If you enjoyed the video, give it a rating, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now. Vintage.